Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ, and they have made for Allah. They have assigned for Allah. Who? The mushrikeen. In the following ayat, some of the practices of the mushrikeen are mentioned. Not just people of Makkah, but all the mushrikeen over there, whether they resided in Makkah or Ta'if or anywhere else, their practices are mentioned over here. The Arabs, they consider themselves to be upon the deen of Ibrahim a.s. And Ibrahim a.s., he believed in Tawheed. He practiced Tawheed, and that is what he established as well. So in these ayat, some of their traditions or their practices are mentioned, and they're nullified, they're negated. That they are far from Tawheed, they are far from the religion of Ibrahim a.s. They are far from justice. وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ, and they have assigned for Allah, meaning in the name of Allah, for His sake, mimma, from that which, meaning a portion of that which, ذَرَأَ, He created. Who created? Allah created. The word ذَرَأَ is from the root letters ذَال, Ra, Hamza. ذَرَأَ literally means to spread, to scatter. And from this it is also used for creating. The word ذُرِّيَّة is also from the same root. Because offspring, children, they grow and they spread. So مِمَّا ذَرَأَ, from which He created, from which He grew, مِنَ الْحَرْثِ, of crop, وَالْأَنْعَامِ, and the livestock animals. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the harth. He produces it. And notice the word ذَرَأَ has been used, not خَلَقَ. Why? Because for harth, what happens? It grows and it spreads as well. Doesn't it? How does it spread? For example, if you have just one weed, what will happen after some time? It will spread over an entire area, over your entire backyard. Similarly, if you have a particular crop, what will happen? You get the grain and it spreads from one country to the other, one city to the other, one house to the other. The produce of one field spreads all over the world. وَالْأَنْعَامِ, and an'am also, what does the an'am include? The cows, sheep, goat, and camel. They also grow and they spread, they multiply. Because ذَرَأَ gives a sense of multiplication. Just as ذُرِّيَّة, it multiplies. So similarly, harth multiplies. An'am multiplies. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the harth and the an'am. But what do these people do? They designate, they assign only a portion of it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nasiban, a share. فَقَالُوا, so they said, هَذَا لِلَّهِ, this is for Allah, meaning a particular percentage or a particular type is only for the sake of Allah. بِزَعْمِهِمْ, according to their claim. And what does it mean by بِزَعْمِهِمْ? As they claim. And it's a lie. They have no basis for this division. They have no basis for it at all. It's a complete fabrication. By their own whims and desires, they have come up with a certain percentage and they say this is for the sake of Allah. Now if you look at it, zakat and ushur for instance, they are specified. They are given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this practice of the mushrikeen, that they would assign a particular portion of a particular type of house, particular kind of an'am, this was a fabrication in the deen. So they would set a portion for Allah, وَهَذَا لِشُرَكَائِنَا, and they would set a portion for who? For their idols. Meaning, for their partners, whom they had set with Allah. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one who created them. They give a portion of it to Allah, and they give a portion of it to who? To their idols. But even then, they're so unfair. فَمَا كَانَ لِشُرَكَائِهِمْ, so what is for their partners? Meaning the share of their partners, the share of their idols. What happens to that share? فَلَا يَصِلُ إِلَى اللَّهِ, it never reaches Allah. Meaning it is never given in the share of Allah. It is never put in the share of Allah. يَصِلُ from the root letters waw, sad, lam, wasala. What does wasala mean? To join, to reach. So it never reaches, meaning they never join it to the share of Allah. What is the share of the idols? Remains exclusively for the idols. Never even is a portion of it taken out for the share of Allah. But on the other hand, وَمَا كَانَ لِلَّهِ, and whatever is for Allah, فَهُوَ يَصِلُ إِلَى شُرَكَائِهِمْ, but the share of Allah, they will give a portion of it to who? To their idols. سَاءَ مَا يَحْكُمُونَ. How evil is what they judge. What is it that they're judging? That Allah alone created everything and gave it to them. And yet, they take of it, they assign a portion of it to Allah, they assign a portion of it to their idols. If the share of the idols falls short, they will take from the share of Allah and give it to the idols. But if the share of Allah falls short, they will never take from the share of the idols and give it to the share of Allah. Now, the mushrikeen, they had innovated these practices. There was absolutely no basis for these practices in the deen. Ibrahim a.s. never taught this. Never ever. There were no shuraka, there were no idols. They made up those idols, and they made up these percentages, these shares, and they made up these practices. Complete innovation. And we see this in our society as well. That sometimes there are certain practices which are so rampant, which are so common, and there is no evidence, there is no basis for them. But everybody does it. Everybody does it. They have no basis in the deen, but they're done in the name of the deen. For instance, if a girl gets married, she's made to walk under the Quran. Is there any evidence for that? No. Is there any basis for that? Nothing whatsoever. Similarly, a few days before she gets married, she has to dress up all in yellow. Is there any basis for that? Nothing whatsoever. Many practices that are common in Muslim societies that are done in the name of deen, but they have nothing to do with the deen whatsoever. And similarly, the mushrikeen had done as well. Now over here, we learned that the mushrikeen, when they expected a new crop, or when they expected the birth of new heads of cattle, new heads of grazing livestock, they used to designate a part of it to who? To Allah, and another part to who? To their idols. Usually, the bigger share would be for who? The idols. And the smaller share would be for who? For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if any of the portion of these associates, of these idols, if by mistake it fell into Allah's portion, for instance, just imagine they have a whole lot of crop, for instance, and they're making two piles, two heaps. Now they're putting a share of it to the pile of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by mistake, they put the whole thing over there. And later on they realize, no, half of it was supposed to go to the share of the idols. Now what would they do? They would take half of that share and they would give it to the idols. But if by mistake they put everything in the share of the idols and they had to take something out of that for the sake of Allah, they wouldn't take it out. Why? Because they feared the idols. They would say, Allah does not need. He is rich. And these idols, they need. And if we don't give them, they'll become upset with us. They were scared of the idols. That's why they would take out of the share of Allah, they would give to the idols. And they would never take anything of the share of the idols and give to Allah. Similarly, if the share of Allah fell short, they would leave it as it was. But if the share of the idols fell short, they would take from the share of Allah and give it to the share of the idols. Now this is something that they had invented themselves. But the question is that Allah does not need any of their harth or an'am, right? And the idols also, what would they do? Nothing. So what was the point? Why would they give a share to Allah and why would they give a share to the idols? They would give it to seek their pleasure, to make them happy. But the portion that was set for Allah, they would disperse it, they would spread it amongst who? The visitors as well as the needy. The people who would come to perform umrah, who would come to do tawaf, who would come to visit the Kaaba, they would spend Allah's share on who? On them. Similarly, if they were needy, they would spend Allah's share on who? On the needy. And whatever belonged to the idols, their share, they would spend it on who? On the caretakers of the idols. This was the whole business. The needy, they'll be deprived of their share. But those people who are taking care of the idols, they will never be deprived of their share. And if you don't please them, if you don't pay them, then they will not help you, or they will threaten you. So there were the caretakers of the idols who would serve at shrines, who would make the idols, who would serve the idols, who would look after the idols, who would basically run this whole business of idol worship. And they're the ones who would eat from this share. So they would compromise on the share of Allah, the poor and the needy, but they would never compromise on the share of their idols or on their own shares as well. So what does it show? They did not fear Allah, but they feared their idols, or they feared people. What's the lesson in this for us? What's the point of mentioning this? Because you may wonder, okay, this is what the mushrikeen did. Doesn't make any sense. It's baseless. Why is it being mentioned? What's the point? What's the objective? To teach us a lesson. That first of all, inventing anything in religion, even if it is quote unquote for the sake of Allah, is something that is forbidden. Even if it is something that is good, that is hasana, still it is forbidden. Because the mushrikeen, when they invented this in the deen, they set a portion for Allah. Isn't that a good thing? If you think of it, you're giving charity. You're giving something for the sake of Allah. That's something good. And whatever share that you have designated for Allah, you're spending it on the poor. You're spending it on the needy. But is that permissible? It's not. You can't fix it. You can give as much sadaqah as you wish, but you cannot fix a percentage except for that percentage which Allah has already fixed for us. So innovating anything in the religion, no matter how good it may seem, it is something that is forbidden, even if it's done for the sake of Allah. Secondly, we learn that we should check our actions as well. That when it comes to difficult situations, when we are of limited resources, when we are limited in our abilities, in our time, in our effort, whose right is it that we neglect? Sometimes, if you look at it, we have distributed our day into worldly tasks. For example, there's our own share, there's a share of our family, and there's a share of our work, and then there's a share of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Isn't it? Some part of our day will go in ibadah. Some part of our day will go in looking after ourselves. Some part of our day will go into looking after our family. Some part will go in doing our work. Now when we are in a tight situation, what do we compromise on? Our sleeping or our praying? When it comes to being tired, where do we compromise? In reciting the Quran or talking on the phone? Doing the lesson or checking email? This is what we need to see. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, سَاءَ مَا يَحْكُمُونَ. How evil is what they do. That when they're in such a situation, they compromise on the rights of Allah. And they never compromise on the rights of others. On their own rights. They have to get their sleep. But they will compromise on their salah. They have to check their email. It's so important every single day. Every few hours. But reciting the Quran, once a week. In the class. Tajweed class. Maybe. If we're interested. If we're not as tired at that time. For example, if a person cannot financially afford a lot of things, he will rent a car to go to a festival, he will buy tickets to go to Wonderland, to go to a theme park and spend the whole day over there. But buying a ticket for an Islamic conference, paying the tuition at an Islamic institute, attending an Islamic seminar, that's something that we will not do. We don't have money over there. When it comes to paying for fulfilling our desires, not a problem. When it comes to paying, spending money for the deen of Allah, for the haqq of Allah, over there we don't have any money. This is unfair. This is injustice. Whatever you do, that's a daraja you will get in the hereafter. وَكَذَلِكَ زَيَّنَ لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ. And likewise, meaning just as this action of theirs has been beautified for them, what is mentioned in the previous ayah, allotting shares to Allah, allotting shares to the idols, compromising on the share of Allah, not compromising on the share of the idols. Similarly, zayyana, he adorned, he beautified. Who beautified? The shuraka. For who? لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. For many among the mushrikeen. Meaning not all the mushrikeen did this, but many, majority did this. What did they do? قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ. Killing their children. Who has adorned this for them? Killing their children? شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ. Their partners. Who does the shuraka refer to? It refers to the shaitan. It refers to the jinn whom they worship. It refers to the idols whom they worshipped. So, idol worship, idolatry, Satan worship, listening to shaitan, has beautified for many mushrikeen killing their own children. Killing their own children. Why? لِيُرْدُوهُمْ, so that they lead them to destruction. Yurdu from the root letters Ra, Dal, Ya. Rada, which means to perish, to be destroyed. And irda is to stumble. It is to cause someone to shatter, to cause someone to be destroyed. لِيُرْدُوهُمْ, so that they destroy them. Meaning, so that these mushrikeen, they destroy their children. Meaning they kill their children. Or, لِيُرْدُوهُمْ, in reality, the killing of children ruins the mushrikeen. It destroys the mushrikeen. Because of the fact that they're destroying their own progeny. They're destroying their own manpower. They're destroying their own population. Like, for example, where people kill daughters, they abort daughters, they don't want them. Or they don't want children at all, so they will abort if they have more than one child. They will not even let the child be born. Then what happens eventually? What happens? There are less women. There are less women. There are less people. There's less manpower. So لِيُرْدُوهُمْ, so as a result, they're destroying themselves. How? By killing their children. وَلِيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ, and so that they make confusing upon them. Yalbisu from the root letters Lam, Ba, Sin. So that they confuse upon them what? Deenahum, their religion. Which religion were they originally on? The religion of Ibrahim a.s. But these innovations, they confused. They muddled up their religion completely. They didn't know what was originally part of the religion and what was fabricated. And they did all of this thinking to be a part of the religion when it was not. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ, and if Allah willed, مَا فَعَلُوهُ, they would have never done it. Allah could have forced them to stay away from these practices. All of this occurred by the leave of Allah. But it doesn't mean that Allah likes it. فَذَرْهُمْ, so leave them. وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ, and whatever they fabricate. So we learn from this ayah that of the Jahili practices amongst the mushrikeen was killing their own children. The mushrikeen kill their children for various purposes. They kill their children for different reasons. First of all, they would kill their daughters in particular. And they would bury their daughters alive. Why? Out of embarrassment and shame. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. Who is maw'udah? One who has been buried alive. The girl who has been buried alive. Just imagine a child, a newborn child, screaming or crying. Little, innocent child. And they bury that child alive. Why? Out of embarrassment, out of shame. Because for the mushrikeen, the relation of a son-in-law was very humiliating. They could not take the fact that somebody else had their daughter. That their daughter would go to someone else. It was very shameful for them. And on the other hand, the daughter, you have to look after her the whole life. All her life. You look after her. She's a burden. She doesn't help you. Because for them, one who can hold the sword, one who can shoot the arrow, one who can defend you in battle is one who is useful. And someone on whom you have to spend and you have to look after, she's a burden. And at the end of the day, she gets married and goes away. You understand? So for them, it was a big burden and it was a source of embarrassment. Because they took a lot of pride in having sons, and not just sons, but multiple sons. We learn in Surah Al-Nahl, ayah 58 and 59, وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدُهُمْ بِالْأُنْسَى. And when one of them is informed of the birth of a female, a person is told, a daughter has been born to you. What happens? ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مُسْوَدًّا وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. His face becomes dark and he suppresses grief. He becomes very embarrassed. يَتَوَارَى مِنَ الْقَوْمِ. He hides himself from the people. مِنْ سُوءِ مَا بُشِّرَ بِهِ. Because of the ill of which he has been informed. And he wonders, أَيُمْسِكُهُ عَلَى هُونٍ أَمْ يَدُسُّهُ فِي التُّرَابِ. Should he keep it in humiliation or bury it in the ground? أَلَا سَاءَ مَا يَحْكُمُونَ. Unquestionably, evil is what they judge. Evil is what they decide. That if you think of it, keeping a woman and thinking it to be a source of embarrassment is something evil. And then, if you don't want to do that, you want to bury her alive, even that is evil. Evil is what they decide concerning the daughter. So they would kill their daughters out of embarrassment. Secondly, they would kill their children out of the fear of poverty. Because remember that the Arabs, many of them were desert dwellers. And life in the desert is very unpredictable. And it's very difficult. For days, you would not have food. Because you can't grow anything. Perhaps all of your animals have died. Because of the sandstorm. Or because of the heat. Or something like that. So the more people you have, the more bellies you have to feed. Therefore, if they had children, and they would think that they cannot afford to have them, they would kill them. Sometimes they would not let their children be born. Meaning while the woman was still pregnant, they would do things that would cause the child to die. And if the child was born, then they would immediately kill the child. Which is why we learn in Surah Al-Nahl, ayah number 31, that وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ إِمْلَاقٍ. And do not kill your children out of fear of poverty. Because نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُهُمْ وَإِيَّاكُمْ. We provide for them and you as well. إِنَّ قَتْلَهُمْ كَانَ خِطَأً كَبِيرًا. Indeed, their killing is ever a great sin. And yes, the people of Mecca, the mushrikeen, the Arabs, the Jahil people, they would do this. Those people who were in Jahiliyyah, they would do this. But isn't this Jahiliyyah present today as well? It is. It is present till today as well. That if a person has daughters only and they find out that their next child is also going to be a girl, before even the child is born, they abort the child. Or if the child is born, it's taken away from the parents. Finished. Like some time ago it was being advertised that spend 500 and save 500,000. Spend 500 to abort the child and save 500,000 that you would spend on your daughter. Can you imagine? We think that was Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is present even today. Similarly, people today, they don't want to have children. We can't afford to have children. Having children is so expensive. You have to look after them, you have to provide for them. That's because we have made our standards so high. We think that we have to have these many clothes for our children, and our child has to have this and this and this accessory, and he has to have a separate room, therefore we cannot afford a child. No, you are not their provider. Allah is their provider. So either people will not have children. If they are expecting a child, they will use ways to prevent that child from being born. And if the child is born, they say we cannot take care of it. They will give it up for adoption. If Allah gives you a child, you are not the child's provider. He is the child's provider. He provided for you, He will provide for the child as well. When the child is in the womb of the mother, who is providing for the child? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes you see the mother is unable to eat anything. She's unable to eat anything. She will go low in her iron, in her energy. But the child will be born perfectly healthy and fine. Because you're not the raziq. You don't put the food in your mouth for the baby. Allah puts it. Allah is the raziq. You're not the raziq. So never should the fear of provision lead a person to killing his own child. Avoiding his own child. Never ever. And sometimes if a person finds out there is a disability in the child, even then what do people say? Abort the child. Why? It's going to be a burden on you. You will have to spend so much on the child. But the fact is, you're not the provider. Allah is the provider. Similarly, the mushrikeen, they would kill their children for the sake of idols. Literally. Human sacrifice. They would do human sacrifice. Just as today, people offer animals as sacrifice on Eid for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The mushrikeen, they would offer their children, which is known as human sacrifice. They would sacrifice human beings. For who? For the sake of their idols, to please their idols. They would dedicate their children for idols, and then eventually they would also slaughter them for the sake of their idols. And we learned that at the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, the river Nile, it would dry up every year. And the people of Egypt, they had this practice that every time that it would dry up, they would get a young girl who was very beautiful. They would dress her up nicely, and they would throw her into the river, thinking that the water would flow again because of that. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he stopped this practice. So it was not just common at the time of Jahiliyyah, it was also common afterwards. Human sacrifice. وَقَالُوا, and they say, another practice of theirs, that they say, هَذِهِ أَنْعَامٌ وَحَرْثٌ حِجْرٌ. They said that this animal, meaning this an'am, this particular an'am, the plural includes cows, goats, sheep, as well as camels, as well as وَحَرْثٌ, and this particular crop, it is hijr, meaning it is prohibited. The word hijr literally means man'. What does mana' mean? To prevent, to prohibit. So hijrun gives a sense of mahjur, meaning it is forbidden, it is mamnu'. From the same root is the word hajar. What does hajar mean? Rock. When you got a rock in your way, then what happens? It prevents you from digging further, doesn't it? So they say that this an'am and harth, it is hijr, meaning it is mamnu', it is forbidden. You can't have anything to do with it. You can't eat it, you can't ride on it, you can't milk it. There are certain restrictions that are going to be applied on this an'am and on this harth. لا يطعمها, none will eat it, إلا, except من نشاء, whoever we will. Meaning, they would set another share of crop and animals, and they would say that no one is going to eat it except for whom we allow. It's forbidden for everyone except for whom we allow. And who was it that whom they would allow? It was of those who served the idols. That it's only the righteous. It's only those who serve the idols. It's only those who have dedicated their lives in the shrine. Only they will eat of it. The caretakers of the idols. And no one else but them will eat this. It's forbidden on them. And all of this was based on what? بِزَعْمِهِمْ, self-made laws, according to their assertion. They had no proof for this. وَأَنْعَامٌ, and other an'am, حُرِّمَتْ, they were made haram. What was made haram of the an'am? ظُهُورُهَا, its backs. ظُهُور is a plural of ظهر. So the back of those animals was made haram. What does it mean by that? That riding them was forbidden. Riding them was forbidden. Earlier we read about the bahira and the sa'iba and the ham. So it is said that this an'am, whose zuhur was forbidden, was the sa'iba and the ham. People were not allowed to ride on them. وَأَنْعَامٌ, and other an'am. What about them? لَا يَذْكُرُونَ, they do not mention اسم الله عليها, the name of Allah upon it. When? At the time of slaughtering it. And instead, they dedicate it to who? To their idols. All of this is iftira, fabrication. Against who? Alayhi, against him. Meaning they have made up all of this and they say that Allah has told us. This is what Allah likes. We're doing it for the sake of Allah. We're doing it to please Allah. But all of this was what? An innovation, a fabrication in the religion. Allah says, سَيَجْزِيهِمْ, soon He will recompense them, بِمَا كَانُوا يَفْتَرُونَ, because of what they fabricate. So they had forbidden certain livestock. No one was allowed to milk them. No one was allowed to ride them. No one was allowed to eat them. Except for who? Except for the caretakers of the idols. Because again, it was their way of making money. And there was some crop. There was some produce as well, which was only permissible for who? For the caretakers of the idols. We learn in Surah Yunus, ayah number 59, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this is iftira. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ, say, have you seen مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُم مِّن رِزْقٍ فَجَعَلْتُم مِّنْهُ حَرَامًا وَحَلَالًا, what Allah has sent down to you of provision, of which you have made some lawful and some unlawful? قُلْ أَاللَّهُ أَذِنَ لَكُمْ, say, has Allah permitted you to do so? أَمْ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَفْتَرُونَ, or are you fabricating this against Allah? So this has no basis in the religion, it's a complete fabrication. We learned earlier in Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 103, that مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ مِن بَحِيرَةٍ وَلَا سَائِبَةٍ وَلَا وَصِيلَةٍ وَلَا حَامٍ. Allah has not made any of this. وَلَكِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. But the disbelievers, they have fabricated this against Allah, and most of them, they don't use reason. وَقَالُوا, and they say, مَا فِي بُطُونِ هَذِهِ الْأَنْعَامِ, what is in the wombs of this livestock? Butun is a plural of batan. And what is the batan? The belly, the abdomen. It includes the womb, it includes the stomach, inner part. So whatever is in the inner parts of these an'am, what does it refer to? Whether it is the womb in which the child is, let's say a female camel is pregnant, a female goat is pregnant, or it is the milk, because milk also comes out from where? From inside. So وَقَالُوا مَا فِي بُطُونِ هَذِهِ الْأَنْعَامِ, what is inside of this an'am? And which an'am was this? The muharrama one, the sacred one, the forbidden one, the sa'iba or the bahira. The sa'iba or the bahira. So what is in the bellies of this an'am? It is khalisatun, it is exclusively for who? لِذُكُورِنَا, for our men. Only men can eat it. Women cannot eat it. Do you see that? Dhukur is a plural of dhakar. This was also a way of giving advantage to men only. The word khalisa from the root letters kha, lam, sad, and khalis and khalisa, the ta at the end is not for female, it's not for feminine, but rather it is za'id for mubalagha. Meaning it is exclusively, only, for who? For our males. And zukur is a plural of dhakar. It is reserved only for them. It is permissible for them only. وَمُحَرَّمٌ, and it is forbidden upon who? عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِنَا, upon our females, upon our women. And even today people have these theories that if a woman eats too much of this particular meat, then that will happen and that will happen. If Allah has made it halal, it's tayyib, you eat it in moderation, nothing's going to happen. وَإِن يَكُنْ مَيْتًا, and if it is dead, فَهُمْ فِيهِ شُرَكَاء, if the child that is born to the camel or the goat or the cow or the sheep, whatever, if it is born dead, then everyone can eat it. The men as well as the women. But if it's alive, only for the men. Because it's very special. Allah says, سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ, Allah will recompense them for their attribution. Wasf. What is wasf? Description. So this description of what is lawful and what is unlawful that they have trumped up, that they have made up themselves, and they have attributed it to Allah, Allah will recompense them for this. إِنَّهُ حَكِيمٌ عَلِيمٌ, Allah is Hakim and He's knowing in what He has made halal and in what He has made haram. So we see that gender discrimination, it has emerged from what? Shirk. Literally, it has emerged from shirk. That this meat only for men. And if it's like this, then women can have it. Whereas we learn in our deen that all food that is halal and tayyib, it is permissible for men and women and children, old and young. It's permissible for anyone. There is no gender discrimination when it comes to such things. قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ قَتَلُوا أَوْلَادَهُمْ, those who have killed their children, they have lost. They have suffered a great loss. They are losers. Who? Those who قَتَلُوا أَوْلَادَهُمْ, who have killed their own children, safahan, because of foolishness, بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ, without any knowledge. Those people who kill their children based on foolishness, without any knowledge, they will suffer great loss. We learned that only specific Arab tribes, they used to kill their children. Everybody wouldn't. There were some people, in fact, who would go and save the children. There were some people who would go and save children who were being buried alive. So everybody did not practice this. There was only some people, which is why Allah says, الَّذِينَ قَتَلُوا أَوْلَادَهُمْ سَفَهًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ, not just all mushrikeen. Previously it was mentioned kathiran, many among the mushrikeen. And it is said that the tribes of Rabi' and Mudar, the tribes of Rabi' and Mudar, they are the ones who would do this. They would kill their children. They would bury them alive. But at the same time, Banu Kinana, they would not do this. And they would do this safahan. What does safahan mean? Safa is foolishness, stupidity. And what's the reason behind that? Lack of knowledge or little intellect. When a person really does not have knowledge, then he acts foolishly. Or a person is not sharp enough. He is not smart. Then he will be foolish regardless of how much knowledge he has. Ibn Abbas radhiyallahu anhu, he commented once that if it pleases you to know how ignorant the Arabs used to be, then recite the verses beyond verse 130 in Surah Al-Anam. All of these practices, what do they show? These practices, what do they show? Foolishness. Especially killing children. So they kill their children out of foolishness. What foolishness? That they feared poverty, thinking that they are the providers and not Allah. Out of ignorance, that killing children is a huge crime. So safahan can be understood as foolishness, or the fact that if Allah provided them, then He can also provide for their children. Then safahan can also be understood as ignorance of the fact that this is something wrong. Ignoring the fact that He is the creator. He is the one who gave you a daughter and not a son. بغير علم, without any knowledge. وحرموا, and they made unlawful ما رزقهم الله, what Allah provided them. Allah gave them children, they killed them. Allah provided them with rizq, and they made it haram. Aren't they suffering loss? Yes, where? In dunya, and obviously in the akhirah as well. If a person is given a child, and he gives that child, he is suffering loss. If a person is giving rizq, and he is making that rizq haram on himself, he is suffering loss. Allah is saying, قَدْ خَسِرَ, in this dunya and in the akhirah. All of this is iftira'an ala Allah, fabricating lies against Allah. قَدْ ضَلُّوا, in fact they have gone astray. وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ, and they are not at all rightly guided. So what is true deen? What is true guidance? What is true hidayah? That when a person accepts the commands of Allah as they are, he accepts the decree of Allah as it is. He keeps what Allah has made halal, halal. What Allah has made haram, haram. He doesn't give this right to anyone else but Allah. And if Allah has given him something, he takes it as it is. He does not go on killing his children, depriving himself of rizq. That is success, and that is guidance. That is rectitude. Recitation.
وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ
لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.